Greenhouse gas emissions from human activity is destabilising our oceans, leading to more superstorms, deadly heat waves and record losses of polar sea ice, according to the new United Nations report issued today. This UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, it's the first to specifically address the impacts of a warming world on the Earth's oceans and the cryosphere. That's the parts of the planet covered in ice, like glaciers and permafrost and sea ice. Kieran Hickey is Senior Lecturer in Geography at U.C.C. He's joining me now from our Cork studio. I know, Kieran, it is a massive report running to some 900 pages or so, but from how you're getting on with reading it so far, what can you tell us about the effects of climate change on our oceans, on the frozen part of the world?
Well, it's very clear, obviously, just even skimming through the report. And I was aware, obviously, of some of the material that was going to be published in the last in this major report as well. But it'll take some time to digest. What we're really seeing here is there's two very interlinked components. The first interlinked component is the loss in the cryosphere, and the cryosphere, as you said, is glaciers, the major ice sheets, Antarctica, which is speeded up by its loss of ice by 3 times the rate of 10 years ago, and Greenland is twice the rate of 10 years ago, and also the loss of glaciers across the globe, particularly the glaciers in the lower latitudes, in tropical areas, but also stretching northwards now into the mid-latitudes as well. And all that ice, when it melts, the water eventually ends up in the ocean. So the loss of in the cryosphere area is driving up the sea levels 2.5 times, according to this report, faster than what it was in the 20th century. And bear in mind, in the 20th century, it went up by about between 12 and 15 centimetres globally. So we're looking at a significant rise in sea levels as a result of this ongoing ice mass loss. And to put that in perspective, Greenland alone, if it was to melt, we'd be looking at a 7-metre sea level rise, which obviously would be catastrophic. But we're not looking at that. And let's be clear about that. We shouldn't be overhyping the catastrophe element of it. We're not looking at that. We're looking at 1.1 metres now, best guess scenario, by the end of the century. But that's a significant increase on the 20th century, massive increase on the 20th century, and it's an upgrade on the previous I.P.C.C. report by about 10 to 15 centimetres as well. So it's gone above the 1 metre level.
Kieran, can I ask the stupid question? What do our oceans do for us?
Well, the oceans at the moment have been an enormous buffer for us. So they've been absorbing most of the increased heat generated by the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, up to 90% of the increased heat as well. But there's a limit to how much they can absorb. And also, as they absorb the heat that's coming in, they expand. So the molecules expand in the seawater, just as when you boil the kettle, the water starts to come out the spout. So that expansion in seawater is carrying on. But now we're getting actual direct rise levels associated with the melting of the glaciers as well. So that buffer we have, and it's been very effective for a long time, is starting to lose some of its ability to absorb even further incremental changes. And it's not just changes that reverse, it's incremental changes that we're seeing all the time.
And as the oceans, if you like, lose the effectiveness that they have had, what is the impact then on these rising sea levels on a country like Ireland?
Well, on a country like Ireland, we're a small island nation. Most of our major, as we know, cities and towns are on the coastline or they're on estuaries. We know that we have flood problems already in these towns and cities. Cork is obviously a very good example, but also Dublin, Galway, etc., Limerick as well. So the challenge is really as the sea levels rise, what's really happening, we don't see the sea level rise because it's an average figure over a whole year, but the base level underneath is incrementally rising by 3 to 5, even 6 millimetres per year, which means that when you get a big storm and the storms generate the flooding, the storm surge gets much, much higher, and the waves also get much, much higher, which means they penetrate much further inland and they overtop existing defences that may have been set up for an entirely different set of conditions. So the vulnerability of our low-lying locations, not just cities but also agricultural land across the country, is increasing as we proceed through this century.
But are we at risk, Kieran, of weather the likes of which we have never seen? I mean, is a country like Ireland at risk of tsunamis?
Well, tsunamis are more a tectonic activity, so they're not directly related to the weather in any way, shape or form. So it's a very different set of problems. But the Atlantic is vulnerable to tsunamis, and we can think of the one in 1755 that affected Cork and the southwestern coast of Ireland as well, with a 3 to 4 metre tsunami wave. But it's not really relevant in this context. What we're looking at here is things like superstorms related to things like hurricanes, tropical cyclones and typhoons, which are huge impacts, as we've seen across across the globe. And we can see from ourselves that although we're outside the major zone of being affected by these, Hurricane Ophelia isn't a good example of where we're still, just on the fringes of being vulnerable, and every now and again we're going to get sideswiped by one of these, possibly with increasing frequency as the seas warm up and they have more and more energy. And one of the things that drives these superstorms is that the more and more energy that's contained in the sea, the more and more of it can be transferred back into the atmosphere in terms of the generation of, in the Atlantic, for example, in major hurricanes as well. So we're certainly not out of it by any means, but we're far enough north, probably escape the worst of the superstorms. But I think, as I've always stated, I think the biggest challenge for Ireland going forward is going to be the sea level rise, because that's where we're most vulnerable.
Kieran, thank you very much. Kieran Hickey there, Senior Lecturer at U.C.C. We're going to talk to the Government Chief Whip, Sean Kine, after this.
EirGrid manages and develops the national electricity